In this video, we're going to get started on the drum game, and we're going to be focusing on the project setup for the overall drum game. So we'll jump right in here inside of Visual Studio, and we'll make a new project. We'll make sure that it's an XNA game, and we'll change the name of the project to Drum Game.
Okay. Easy so far. Are we done yet?
Not quite.
Oh, man.
We're actually going to start off from a completely clean project here, unlike we did earlier when we moved from the sound engine to the music engine.
Sure.
And the reason is just to make sure that everything is handled cleanly and from the ground up.
Okay.
Especially since the sound/music demo had a lot of actual code that demonstrated its capabilities. Here in the real game, a lot of things will be handled differently. There will be a lot of subsystems in place to handle the actual happenings and events that occur.
Well, it makes sense. The first two projects were really just kind of proof of concept to get some things rolling, and now we're ready for the final thing, so it's a good idea to start over.
Now, we will be leveraging some of the assets originally created, namely the exact project and the actual sound engine code. We'll be bringing back that code back into this new project. But let's start here from the top, and the first thing to address is bringing in the game's textures. Now, the way we want to handle any type of visual information is in a skinnable setup. So we're actually going to create what we're going to term a style system, where the style consists of all visual elements.
Okay.
And then all of that will be contained together. So that way, things such as fonts and textures will both be considered part of the style system.
So, yeah, you're using style as kind of an all-inclusive term to include the skin of something as well as positioning of information, any fonts, anything like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
So let's get started with the style portion of the content project. So we'll right-click on Content, and we'll add a new folder. This folder will be called Style. Now, the first thing we'll add to Style are a couple of sprite fonts. So we'll right-click on Style, we'll go to Add New Item, we'll grab sprite font as the type, and the first one we'll call font_small. We'll add that in, give it a second to load up the XML file for the font, and there's a handful of settings we need to change inside of this font. First is the font name itself. We're going to go with the Miramonte font. We're going to leave the font size 14, but we're going to change the font from regular over to bold. So we'll scroll down a little bit down to Style, and we'll change this over to bold. Now we'll go back over to the Style folder, and we'll add a second font. This one we'll call Font Large.
Okay.
And once again, we'll go with the Miramonte font. So Miramonte. The size this time will be 35, and once again the style will be bold. Alright, that takes care of our fonts. Now we need to bring the game's textures in. Now over here I have the source art that we're going to be using for the skin, if you will. It's a series of textures, primarily the screen backgrounds, but in addition to backgrounds we also have the effect, which is going to be used for the note hit effect later in the game. We have the actual note graphic, and we have the staff background graphic.
Okay.
Now, the usage of these will be addressed throughout the design of the game itself, but we want to make sure that we get these in place from the beginning so that once we get into the code, we simply have the assets ready. So we're going to take all of these textures, and we're going to drag them into the style folder of our content project, drop them all in, and we get them all added here as assets. So that takes care of our textures. Now, the next thing we want to address are the sounds. Earlier in the sound engine video, we had set up a samples folder, brought in WAV files, and created a scenario where, in addition to the raw samples, we also had an exact audio project to build those into the format required by XNA. So we're going to create a similar setup here. Under Content, we'll add a new folder. This will be called Samples. And we're going to go back to our source data directory and once again bring in all of the original WAV samples for our different drums.
Okay.
Drop those into samples. we'll make sure that we grab all of these actual samples. We don't want to build them directly. We want to let an exact project handle the building. So we'll change our build action to none. We'll change the copy to output directory to be copy if newer. And that will make sure that these get passed along to the game itself. And then our direct sound engine will have access to the actual samples.
I was going to say, the exact version won't even use those, will it?
Nope. It won't even, the exact one already has the sound bank and the wave bank built into
Right.
its own format. The reason for passing these onto the game is simply so the direct sound version will be able to play them.
Which is kind of an interesting point, because if you're building this game and you're not planning on using direct sound and was skipping that, you really wouldn't need to have this samples folder.
Exactly. You'd probably end up, you could just exclude them from the project once you had decided to only publish to exact.
Right. Just thinking out loud.
The nice thing is leaving them both here for development purposes allows us to switch back and forth between the exact engine and the direct sound engine.
Right.
Immediately without having to change the actual files. But you're right, when we go to publish the game, we would want to decide on one set of files or the other, depending on who the target recipient was. Alright, now that we have these sample files, we need to get that exact audio project set back up. But fortunately, really the project simply consists of that .xap file. So what we're going to do is jump over here to our Visual Studio Projects folder, and we'll simply get the original exact project backed out of here. Now we do need a place inside of the project in the drum game to place it, so I'm going to add a new folder to the content project called exact. Then we're free to go to our original sound engine demo, which we rename music engine, into sound engine, into content. Down here we have exact, and we want to grab this drums.xap project, drag that over and drop it into our exact folder.
Gotcha.
Now, just to make sure that the associations still work, because if you remember, this project is dependent on a few folders up, there being the samples folder that has all the source data in it. So what we're going to do is we'll actually build the project.
Let's see if you get any errors.
And this will make sure that everything worked. If we had errors with some referencing, we should get build errors. But instead, we get build succeeded, and we can verify the results by going back to projects, jumping out of the sound/music engine demo, and going into our drum game. Then we'll go all the way down to the output folder. So into bin, x86, debug, content, samples has wave files in it, and exact has our wave bank, our sound bank, and our settings file.
Nice.
So the exact project has pulled over nicely. Now, a couple things left to address, first of which is the sound engine and the specific sound engines that we had originally coded. We want to move those directly into our new project rather than recode them, of course. So what I'm going to do is I'll collapse the whole content subproject, and we'll begin with a new folder structure to organize the classes that will be added to the drum game. So right-click on drum game, we'll add a new folder, and we'll call this folder core. Core is just that. It's going to contain the core engine elements of the drum game. It will contain things like the base sound engine, the base rendering engine, the base classes that will handle songs and notes.
Okay.
Everything that is very low level and very generic. Or if you're looking at it in a class hierarchy sense, of the very high level classes. And in addition to core, we're actually going to add a specific folder for sound engines. And the idea is that sound engine itself was the base interface, but we got into some really specific stuff when we started using APIs like XNA's sound engine and direct sound. So the idea...
This would hold the classes for different APIs?
Exactly.
Okay.
Since the details in there, for a loose term you could say, contain a lot of dirty implementation specifics. And not to mention that we can have any number of sound engines.
Sure.
So we have the end results all stored in a specific folder. And we'll call this sound engines. While we're setting up the directory structure, I'll go ahead and add one more, and that is a game folder. The idea is that game will contain a lot of the classes that utilize core elements, but extend them in a way to make them useful to actual gameplay. That means specific versions of maybe a song class to be able to be used for playback or for recording or for whatever an end target purpose is.
Okay, gotcha.
Game is also the place in which all the core systems will be brought together, meaning where they'll be set to leverage each other, where you'll go from loading data to processing it to making a song to checking the playback of a song.
So at this point, just about any class that we're going to create should appear in one of these 3 folders.
Generally, yes. There will be
with a few exceptions here and there.
There'll be a handful added as we get new subsystems. There'll be additional, if you want to call them subsystem level folders, like sound engines.
Okay.
With sound engines, we already have the sound system put together.
Right.
But there's also going to be things like input systems, and the idea is that you'll still have a core component of the input system.
Okay.
But then, as we add device support, the classes that support various input devices like keyboards or drum controllers will be stacked in a different folder altogether. So,
all right, that makes sense.
All right. Now that we have our folder structure in place, let's grab the sound engine classes that we had coded in the sound engine demo. We'll simply jump up back to our Visual Studio Projects folder. We'll jump back out of the Drum Game project and back here to Sound Engine. We'll jump into Sound Engine, and here we see we have the Sound Engine, the Sound Engine Direct Sound, and Sound Engine Exact. Sound Engine is going to go into Core, and Sound Engine Direct Sound and Sound Engine Exact
We'll go into the sound engines.
will go into specific sound engines. Now, there's one last thing I want to do with the sound engines. In the game itself, it's very useful for debugging and testing purposes to be able to run the game with no sound API access.
Okay.
For testing purposes, if you want to check a various part of the game and check it independent of any sound system.
Such as like maybe how the draw code's working or anything graphically oriented.
Or even something as simple as a configuration error that ends up or results in the game not being able to find or use a sound engine.
I gotcha.
What we're going to do is, since the game is going to be coded much like the sound engine demo in this regard, where once a sound engine field is created, the rest of the code expects a real usable sound engine to exist there. None of the rest of the code is going to be meant to deal with that sound engine being unset.
Sure.
So what we're going to do is we're going to make a sound engine that is meant to be an empty sound engine. The idea is to extend the base sound engine and add no functionality.
Okay, so if you wanted to actually test things without any sound playing, you could just call on the null engine.
Exactly, and that's exactly what we're going to call it. We're going to make a null sound engine so that we can plug that into the game. All of our sound playing calls will still have something to call out to,
Cool.
but the result is nothing actually happens.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So to do this, we'll simply create a new class. We'll call this sound engine null. We'll add this class in. Give it a second to bring the class up. We'll pull out this sub namespace, since of course we're now creating all these classes inside of folders. Visual Studio is going to want to be helpful and try to include these as namespaces. In our case, though, we'd rather have all these classes appear as though they were in the same namespace. The actual sound engine null itself, of course, needs to extend sound engine. You'll notice that sound engine doesn't appear right off the bat. This is because we brought in the sound engine classes out of a project with a different namespace, which means that they're in namespace currently music engine.
Gotcha.
We're going to change this out to drum game. And we'll load up sound engine direct sound, change its namespace, sound engine exact, change its namespace. And now if we go back over to sound engine null, sound engine exists in the drum game namespace.
Gotcha. Very nice.
Now, as far as coding the sound engine null, that's it. We're simply saying that it extends sound engine. Sound engine null is not abstract, which means we can instantiate it.
And it's completely empty.
Exactly, because all of those methods were virtual, so technically they had implementations, they just happened to be blank.
All right. Well, what comes next?
Well, there is one last thing to do. And before we do that, I do want to build and make sure that we have no major syntax errors. You will notice that we do have a lot of errors, and that leads us to our final step. Of course, the direct sound engine is leveraging a whole lot of SlimDX types.
Right, and we're not yet referencing SlimDX.
Exactly. So we need to jump up here to our overall project's references. We need to jump in here and add a reference. And then we need to select SlimDX. Once again, I'll simply hit S. And the first assembly beginning with S is SlimDX. We'll hit OK to add that in. Hit F6, rebuild.
Yeah, I watched them all disappear before you even build.
So even IntelliSense picked up on that as soon as we brought the SlimDX assembly into the mix. And with that, let's make sure that everything gets saved out. And that will take care of project setup for the drum game.
Cool, so we're ready to rock with some actual code now.